Qualified facility under the Preventive Controls Rule for human food introduction. We have already mentioned a few of the exemptions to being fully covered by the Preventive Controls for Human Food Rule, a farm conducting certain low-risk activities and retail food establishments. We have also touched on modified requirements under the Preventive Controls Rule for human food for farm mix type facilities. Now, we're at a point where we have figured out that we are operating what would be considered a straightforward food processing facility under the FSMA Preventive Controls for Human Food Rule. There are still exemptions and modifying requirements that may apply. A fully covered food processing facility under the FSMA PC rule will have to register with FDA, have a person who is a preventive controls qualified individual conduct a hazard analysis, and oversee the development of a food safety plan. The facility will also be inspected on a regular basis to ensure compliance with the regulation. There may also be modified requirements under the FSMA Preventive Controls for Human Food Rule if a business meets one of the two criteria to be considered a qualified facility. The first is to have less than $1 million in annual sales adjusted for inflation. The other is average food sales less than $500,000 for the last 3 years, and sales to qualified end users must exceed sales to all others. Qualified end users are direct to consumers or to restaurants located within 275 miles of the business. If either of these criteria apply, the facility still has to register with FDA and keep documentation supporting their qualified exemption status. However, the facility will be exempt from hazard analysis and risk-based preventive controls. Qualified facilities still have to comply with current good manufacturing practices, also called GMPs. They must also file an attestation form with FDA stating they meet the criteria of a very small business. The Preventive Controls for Human Food Rule aims to have food processing facilities build a food safety system. For those with modified requirements, following good manufacturing practices or GMPs is still required. GMPs are the base level things that must be done to mitigate food safety risks and serve as a foundation for a food safety program. We have one module that focuses on GMPs, but they include things like making sure your employees wash hands, that equipment is routinely cleaned and sanitized, etc. After GMPs, the hazard analysis is the next most important piece of the food safety system. The hazard analysis is a systematic review of your process that highlights all the potential hazards in your product and process. Then those hazards are ranked as being controlled by prerequisite programs or are reasonably foreseeable and require a preventive control to be implemented to reduce the risk. There are 4 types of preventive controls that may be implemented. This includes process controls, formerly called critical control points, that include things you do in the facility to control a hazard like thermal processing, acidifying foods, etc. Sanitation preventive controls are those that control hazards in the environment that may cross-contaminate ready-to-eat foods. Allergen controls are those that aim to reduce allergen mislabeling. Supply chain preventive controls are those that require supplier verification for ingredients that may harbor a hazard if not controlled by the supplier. The hazard analysis, preventive controls, and all other documentation related to monitoring, verifying, and corrective actions of the preventive controls make up the food safety plan. Finally, a recall plan is required that outlines the procedures in the scenario where a food product must be recalled. A food safety plan is required for food processors fully covered by the Preventive Controls for Human Food Rule. Here is a very basic case study to show how different regulations might apply based on the food being processed, the scale of the business, and where the product is being sold. In this case study, we are focusing on a strawberry jam producer. Fresh strawberries used to make the jam are considered a high-acid fruit and have a pH that typically ranges from 3.32 to 3.5. The strawberry jam recipe adheres to the standard validity for the production of fruit-based jams, jellies, and preserves outlined in 21 CFR Part 150, which dictates the ratio of fruit to sugar in the jam. The resulting jam has both a low pH and a low water activity, making it a low-risk food. Now, let's get into how different regulations apply to strawberry jam producers depending on the food production facilities, scale, and sales. Most states have a cottage food law that allows for production of certain low-risk foods in a home kitchen for sale to consumers. Each state's law varies, but most allow for the production of fruit-based jams, jellies, and preserves that adhere to the standard of identity outlined in 21 CFR Part 150. Since the strawberry jam producer is located in California and the recipe used adheres to 21 CFR Part 150, it can be produced under the California cottage food law as long as the business grows retail sales below the maximum allowable limit and sells the product within California. The jam could also be produced by a retail food establishment, such as a restaurant or grocery store, for example, as long as its production adheres to state and local laws. Jams and jellies produced from high-acid fruits are allowed to be produced as a farm mix type facility under the FSMA Preventive Controls for Human Food Rule, as long as the business has less than 500 employees and the annual sales are less than $1 million adjusted for inflation. If not on the farm, the strawberry jam producer could be a qualified facility under the FSMA Preventive Controls for Human Food Rule as long as the business has less than 500 employees and has annual sales less than $1 million. If this strawberry jam producer has over 500 employees and grosses over $1 million in annual sales, then the business would be subject to the full requirements of the FSMA Preventive Controls for Human Food Rule. Here are some resources for more information.